Yum, yum.
Greg here from Pixel Fondue. About 5 months ago, I made a video discussing the possibility of open sourcing Moto. A lot has happened since then, so this video is to catch up from starting 5 months ago up until my phone call with the Foundry last week. So if you've been wondering what's going on with this project, like I said, I created this video. I can't believe it's been 5 months, but it has been 5 months. It's fairly popular. I got about 5,000 views, and there was a lot of support with the idea of open sourcing Moto. It's just a question I posed, and I started a channel on the Pixel Fondue Discord, and just see if we get some support and to talk about who would volunteer and if this is a good idea. And over the months, a lot of things has happened. One of the first things I did was I reached out to all of the original developers from Wixology and the founders, some of the people who worked there very early on, just to get their blessing. This was their work that would be put on display if we are able to open source Moto, and I wanted to make sure they were okay with it. And every single one of them was very supportive of the proposition of open sourcing Moto and had offered help where they could. So that's good. The second thing I did was just ask for volunteers, people who would be interested in this project, gathered them together, started a private discussion channel. These are people you should be familiar with, people who had created, developers who worked on Moto kits, plugins, things like that, as well as former Foundry developers who worked on Moto for a long time and no longer work there due to Moto being end of line and the team being let go. And we spent a long time, months, discussing how we should approach this project. How do you start a foundation? Like, how do we get the Moto from Foundry? What are the first things we do? There's a lot of information to go over. What open source licenses do you choose? All that kind of stuff. And I had some good back and forths with Ton Rosendahl from the Blender Foundation. He was successful in organizing a crowdfunding effort to buy Blender from the owners some 25 years ago and open source it. And Blender eventually became the behemoth it is today. And so we're trying to do the same thing with Moto. And along the way, I had multiple conversations with the Foundry as well, and just in terms of how can we get this done. So, it evolved and changed over a few months, but eventually we settled on, okay, well, let's, we're going to need to be able to buy Moto from the Foundry, or rather, more specifically, Roper Industries, who owns the Foundry. So Roper is a large public company. Not that. That's the monitor I just bought. This one, Roper. They own a lot of companies. They're huge, right? Here's the Foundry. They own Foundry. Foundry's a big company. All of these companies are Foundry size or bigger, really. Like, it's Roper is a big company. And they own the Foundry. They bought them. That means they own Moto. And so we need to be able to purchase Moto from Roper. And so how do we go about doing this? Well, the general idea would be that we would sort of take the temperature of the community to see how much money we thought we could raise. And so instead of just jumping in both feet first, do a Kickstarter and just sort of, seeing what we could do, or just trying to make Foundry an offer, whether we know we could raise that much money or not. We need to have an idea of how much money we can raise before we can really make any sort of offer to the Foundry. So the idea was to do a poll and see what sort of soft commitments we could get in terms of raising money to acquire Moto from Roper Foundry and open source it. And then if we got good results from the poll and we felt we could actually raise this money, we would make an offer to the Foundry. And if Foundry was good with that offer, then we would proceed down the road of raising money, probably via Kickstarter or some similar crowdfunding platform. The way a Kickstarter works is if you need to raise $100, let's say, and that's your goal, and over the course of a month or 2 months, whatever the length of the Kickstarter is, you're able to raise $100, you meet the goal, or maybe you raise $500. It's like, it's wildly successful. Then people's cards are charged and you get that money. But if the goal is $100 and you only raise $90, then you get no money. Nobody's card is charged. Now, that seemed like a good idea because we don't want anybody to lose money unless we actually are able to acquire Moto. We'd also would have to engage some legal representation to enable this sort of transaction. Buying software from companies, particularly public companies, requires lawyers. Lawyers are not inexpensive, and the money we raised would have to cover that. It would have to cover being able to start a foundation. It would have to cover removing code from Modo that was whose license was not applicable to open source, or code that could not be open sourced due to patents or something. And so there's a number of things that would have to happen if we were able to acquire Modo from the Foundry. Well, the plan was to do some bug fixes and some improvements to Moto 17.1, which is the latest version. The latest version of Moto never was really quite finished. It had been delayed a couple of times, I think, and the developers were eventually, of course, laid off because Moto was end of line. And the idea was we'd want to get something into contributors' hands. If you contributed to a Kickstarter, we'd want something into your hands very quickly. And so the idea was to do sort of finish Moto 17, put that out there. Then we would work on removing code from Modo to make it open source or make it legally compliant with whatever open source license we chose. And having establishing a foundation to move that code into, and doing things like figuring out how to raise additional money to continue to develop Modo, and all the things that an open source software foundation needs. And then eventually, of course, release a version of Modo as free open source software. So that was the plan, and we put together the poll, we were ready to release that. And I did want to have another conversation with the Foundry prior to doing that, just to talk to their lawyers to make sure we weren't violating anything in the NDA, and also just make sure that they're good with this, because they'd been, a very honest partner and talked with us and, spoken with us in good faith, or with me in good faith this entire time. And I just wanted to give them a heads up. And after the conversation last week, it just became apparent that the reality is the price that Roper wants for Modo is truly just beyond what I think we can raise from our community. The Modo community is not very big, but even if we were able to draw in the broader 3D community and a number of companies, game companies, visual effects companies, apparel companies that used Modo and had a fairly big investment in it already, I really don't think we would be able to raise the amount of money that Roper wants at the moment. In fact, I don't think we would even be close. So in short, this whole project is now on hold, and it may be on hold indefinitely. The ball is really in Roper's court, and right now they've decided that the amount of money that they feel Modo is worth and that they would like for it is just beyond what we can raise. And it doesn't really matter if I agree with that, or if we as the community agree with that, or whatever the sort of reality on the ground is. That's how they feel, and they own it, and they can do what they want with it. And so, I was given assurances by the Foundry, who I said is I think would have loved to have made this happen if they could have, that they would absolutely give me a call. That'd be the first person they called if anything changes, whether it's in the price of Modo or something else, and along Roper's interest in it. They would let me know. But right now, it's just not matching up. What they want, what we can raise, they're just too far apart. And I hope you believe me that if I thought there was any chance we could raise enough money to buy this, I would absolutely go for it. And I hope you understand that even though it's been 5 months, I understand it's been a long time, but this stuff takes time. We all have jobs, we all have families and lives, and putting something like this together is not easy. And I hope you understand, I really left no stone unturned. I checked every box. I wiggled every doorknob. I did everything I could to try and release Modo into the free open source arena, which I think it has a really valuable place there, despite its sort of lack of commercial value. I think it has a lot of value as a public service, or to the public. But it's just not in the cards right now. And so, we need to sort of move on right now from this. It's not the ending that I wanted. It's not the news I wanted to bring you. but it's just the reality of the situation. We need to move on. If you have been waiting to see if this were to happen before you switch to other software, well, I think you need to start looking at switching to other software or integrating other software into your work. You know, in my company, and not Pixel Fondue, but my Sabertooth Productions, my production company, I've had for 20 years, 25 years actually. You know, I've got 20 years worth of Moto projects. I have clients come to me all the time from, 3-5 years ago with a product that's been updated or something like that where I need to load it into Moto and make changes. You need to make sure that Moto is going to work for you. So we have 10-year licenses available to everybody who's bought Moto, or also a permanent license to everybody who bought the permanent version. And you can download, I think, any version of Moto to work with this, whether you like to use 16 or 17 or both. I suggest you follow the video I put on YouTube and go to the Pixel Fondue Discord and go to the Moto questions section and make sure that you have the Moto installables and the Moto licenses so you have it available to you, because it's not going to be open source anytime soon or ever. And you look at other software that can do for you what Moto did. Doesn't mean you have to stop using Moto. Still works great. Still my favorite software. I'm going to keep using it. But I'm also going to integrate another program into my work because I have to, right? It's just the reality of the situation. So, now that we're sort of wrapping this up, I just, let me just put a bow on it, I guess. Was it worth it to even try this? I do think it was. Like, we had, it's a disappointing ending. And again, they're willing to sell Moto. There's just no way we can raise that much money. We're a small community. If you look 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when Blender was purchased or crowdfunded and open sourced, I think it was for like $100,000. That was a long time ago. And at the time, Blender was sort of an oddball 3D package in an industry that was just beginning. It really didn't have the commercial penetration that Moto did, and AAA gaming and indie gaming and visual effects and filmmaking. It didn't have this, the sort of penetration Moto had in apparel and shoes and clothing and bags and things like that Moto is used for. So Moto obviously has some value attached to it still. And even though they end-of-lined it and the use Moto's sort of users have declined recently, you can take a look at recent Pixel Fondue videos. You can take a look at what Moto, the subscription price of what you can take a look at what the subscription price was, and you can kind of get an idea of how much money roughly Foundry was making with Moto, and you get an idea of some percentage of that we would need to raise, and it's just beyond what we can do. But I do think this was a good idea. I do think it was worth it trying to just do everything we could to try and get this out in the open source community. I do think it's a good idea to have open source 3D software, general purpose software that's not just Blender. Blender is fantastic. Tons of Blender users. Having additional software out there gives an option to people who Blender just doesn't click with. Some software clicks better with other people. And there's a lot of people, of course, that just use Moto and Blender together. In fact, I think most Moto users have now installed Blender and use them together. And eventually, if we're not able to ever do this, we'll just eventually move over to Blender. But having open source software just gives the industry a bit of a moat against the future. It's a really weird time right now. We don't know where this industry is going to be in 5 years. Open source software gives some hope to people who like to make things, who like to make art with their own skill and hard work and talent. And having more open source software, free open source software, is better than having less free open source software. At the end of the day, we don't know where generative AI is going to go. We don't know where competition from these, commercial 3D packages competing with something like Blender is going to go. We don't know how that's going to shake out. We don't know how, the industry, visual effects industry and the gaming industry, how they're going to respond to Gen AI, how they're just going to respond to the general market forces. They've had a hard time of it lately, both gaming and visual effects. Any of these things can cause a company to abandon their software. So you have something like Autodesk and Maya. If Maya is pressured from Gen AI, if Maya is pressured from industries not doing well and people not subscribing to their software, if Maya is pressured from people moving to Houdini or people going with Blender because it's free, or maybe moving to Cinema 4D or something, there's nothing to stop Autodesk from just looking at Maya and saying, okay, we've got 300 products for Autodesk. This one's doing bad. It's done bad for a few years. Just yank it. And that's what happens. That's what happened to Moto. That's what happens to software in various industries, especially if the company that owns the software is a public company. That can happen. And Autodesk has already done something like that to XSI, where they just bought software and killed it without any remorse. And so having open source software hedges against that a little bit. It's always going to be available, and anybody who wants to work on it from a developer standpoint, anybody who wants to use it from an artist standpoint, can use it. Right now, it's in terms of 3D full service 3D package, is just Blender. I still think Modo has a place there. And like I said, if there's anything I can ever figure out to move Modo into that space, I'll absolutely do it. And I honestly feel like Foundry, for their part, would like to see Modo live on as well. Right? But they can only do what they can do, right? They're owned by Roper, and Roper is setting the price. And that's just the way things are right now. There's really nothing else for me to say about it. I kind of feel like the community is let down. Obviously, I wish this would have worked out, but we need to draw a line here and not string anybody along. People need to look out for their careers and do what's best for them. Pixel Fondue Discord will be a great place if you're watching this. If you haven't joined yet, come there. People will help you transition from software. We have support forums for Blender and Houdini and Unreal. I think we'll probably add a Cinema 4D one. Plasticity, of course, is fantastic. And some others, right? Octane, of course, is fantastic. And Modo is still being developed to some degree with plugins. Steve Hill just released a new texture plugin, which I'll do videos on. And I'll continue to do videos for Modo because people, at the end of the day, you're not going to throw out 5, 10, 15, whatever, 20 years of knowledge on a software, or you're also going to continue to use software that you like to use, and people like to use Modo. So there's going to be Modo users for a long time to come, and there will still be updates and scripts and plugins and stuff like that for a while to come, I think, as well. But right now, this is the end of the road, temporary. Let's just think of it as the end of the road right now for this Modo open source endeavor, unless something changes on Roper's side. We've done all we can do, and there's nothing else we can do. So that's it. So I'll see you on the Discord, and have a good week.
Yum, yum.